Hello, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us here today. My name is Kasper Szulecki. I work here at NUPI at the Climate and Energy Research Group. We're really happy to host this is linked to a project here called Pulling Power of Paris, which allowed us to bring Professor Hayley Stevenson from Buenos Aires, from Universidad Torquato di Teja. And she agreed to present some of her most recent research on Latin American environmental politics. Now, if you think about Latin America environmental politics, of course, you think about extractivist states that generate a lot of their income from natural resources, and very often on the occasion get into conflicts with indigenous populations, violating their rights, which sounds a lot like Norway. But today we're really focusing on Latin America. And jokes aside, environmental defenders, as they're called, are a large group in Latin America, and actually 2/3 of environmental defenders that are killed every year in the world are killed in Latin America. So the 2018 Escazú Agreement, as it's called, I actually wrote down the full name, Regional Agreement on Access to Information, Public Participation and Justice in Environmental Matters in Latin America and the Caribbean. This agreement of 2018 has been a really important step forward in protecting those people, and Hayley is going to tell us more about that. We are also happy to have here our local experts, Professor Benedicte Bull from the Center for Development and the Environment at the University of Oslo, and our own in-house expert, Lucas de Oliveira Paes, who is a senior researcher at NUPI. So we'll start with the lecture by Hayley, then we're going to have a short panel where our two other guests are going to comment on this and engage in some discussion, and then we'll open the floor to your questions. And I would just also like to remind everyone and also welcome all those who are watching us on the live stream. So this is actually going online as well and will be available on YouTube afterwards. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much for the opportunity to share some of my research, and thanks for coming out on this very cold morning, at least for me arriving from Buenos Aires. It was 37 degrees when I left, so it's quite a shock. So as Kasper introduced, I'm going to talk about this new multilateral treaty adopted in Latin America, and it's the first environmental treaty adopted in the region, and so it's been celebrated as an environmental democracy agreement. This kind of agreement will be, for most kind of Europeans, this type of agreement is quite familiar because it's based on Principle 10 from the Rio Declaration in 1992, and as well as modeled on the Aarhus Convention, but with the clear intention that it be negotiated by Latin American countries for Latin American countries. There was the option, Aarhus is a European agreement that's open to countries from other regions, so Latin American countries had the opportunity to join that agreement, and none of them did. And as Chile was looking to be a member of the OECD, there was a push to, this is an area of your policy that you need to improve on, access rights, so why don't you join Aarhus? Chile kind of decided, well, no, we don't think that agreement is for us, but we'll explore the possibility of negotiating our own agreement. And that kind of coincided with civil society pushing for access rights as well. Rio +20, there was a real interest in making Rio +20 not just another one of these mega conventions that don't produce more than a declaration. And so that kind of coincided the state interests of Chile with a push from civil society, and that kind of those conditions, favorable conditions, coincided to produce this the Escazú Agreement on access rights. Now, for me, this was interesting. I moved to Argentina. I'm Australian, but I spent 6 years in the UK, and I moved to Argentina in 2017 just as these kind of negotiations were in their kind of final phase. And I was really quite struck by this because I'd been studying since about 2009. I'd been studying the democratic quality of environmental governance, and I was really quite struck that in a region where these are really quite sensitive issues around extractivism, and that strengthening access rights could potentially affect ongoing kind of investment in extractivism. And I was interested in, wow, there's this real interest in negotiating an access rights agreement, especially not just any agreement, but a legally binding treaty. And this is particularly at the time that hadn't been confirmed, but then in 2018, when it was adopted, the fact that it was a legally binding treaty to me was really quite surprising because, broadly in multilateralism, and not just in environmental multilateralism, but multilateralism in general, there's this move towards soft institutions, soft law, informal institutions, kind of very soft commitments, declarations or codes of conduct. But adopting legally binding treaties is very rare these days. And so not only was this a topic that can be potentially quite sensitive, but also they were adopting this legally binding treaty. So I was really quite interested in analysing what was going on. At the time I was finishing off another research project, so it took me a little while to get around to it. But what I'm going to talk about today is based on this three-part analysis of the agreement that I've done. Firstly, the negotiation process about how they did produce this legally binding treaty, looking at the actors involved, the strategies that they adopted to produce a legally binding treaty. Secondly, analysing the ratification patterns, which have been really quite interesting because it's become so ideological. It didn't begin that way. At first I thought, well, this is probably an agreement sponsored by, Bolivia, Ecuador, those kind of countries that we associate with at least internationally, kind of promoting democracy on environmental issues. Of course, not always coinciding with domestic practice, but at least rhetorically. But at the beginning, in 2012, this was actually a very ideologically diverse group of countries that were promoting the agreement and leading the negotiations. And it was only after it was adopted and it was open for signature that it became very ideological. So now it's become, almost associated as a left-wing project in the region, and didn't begin that way at all. In fact, there is no right-leaning, there's no country with a right-leaning government has ratified the agreement. It's different in the Caribbean, and so I'm going to be talking about Latin America today because something that I didn't quite appreciate at the time, but I do now, is that the Caribbean is really quite different, and it's hard to compare with Latin America. And then thirdly, which is what I'm going to talk more about today, is the implementation and thinking about, well, how consequential can this agreement really be? What is its democratic potential, and what kind of measures and procedures would help it to fulfill that democratic potential? So this is what I'm going to focus more on today, but perhaps in our discussion between the three of us and in discussion with the audience, aspects of those other parts will come up as well. So just a little bit more context, or two kind of concerns that motivate my research, probably more generally, but also in the context of this project. Concerns that make me kind of a little bit critical or concerned, or I don't want to, but maybe a little bit pessimistic about the potential of the agreement. First, that states tend to have increasingly this tendency to negotiate agreements with which they can quite easily comply. I think ambitious multilateral agreements are really quite rare. And we've seen this in the context of Escazú, where in a context where some voices are raising concern or are opposed to the agreement, the justification that is often made by both state and non-state actors is that, well, the obligations of Escazú mostly reflect what we already have in our domestic institutions and domestic law. Now, I think that kind of argument might help to mitigate some concerns, but I don't think I think it's kind of raises alarm bells when we know that, you know, existing domestic institutions and laws are completely inadequate for guaranteeing our access rights. So if the agreement is mostly reflecting what states already have, then I don't think that's that's a positive thing. It doesn't kind of bode well for ambition. This second concern, this motivating concern of the research, is what is this dominant characteristic of institutions, all institutions, organizations, universities, domestic and international institutions, is what sociologists call organized hypocrisy. This is a kind of a decoupling of rhetoric or rules and then actual actions. So an organization may adopt certain rules, have certain rules in writing, but they're kind of decoupled from actions, or they have some rules that guide some actions and other rules that guide other actions, and those rules are in tension with each other. There's an inconsistency, which is the norm. Inconsistency of rules and rhetoric and action is the norm in institutions and not an exception. This is because often institutions face competing values and competing demands that cannot be easily reconciled. So a couple of years ago, perhaps some of you have seen this paper. Oh, I didn't include it here. No, I didn't include it. So I published this paper a couple of years ago about this kind of hypocrisy in the global climate regime, and that kind of that observation about hypocrisy has really been at the forefront of my mind when I was thinking about the Escazú Agreement, because we know that there are important tensions in extractivist democracies in Latin America, where extractivism is both a source of a threat and a source of security. For the state, it's a source of security with, you know, generating foreign currency and taxes. But for some communities, it's a threat to their livelihoods. And so states have rules that protect human rights, and they have rules for promoting investment, and they're irreconcilable, or they're in tension, and there's really no effort to, in general, there's no effort to kind of resolve the tension between those rules. They just exist in tension. And so I think a major challenge for implementing this new agreement in a way that really strengthens democracy is to recognize the considerable limitations in existing arrangements, and, you know, being willing to resolve those problems. So I think it's going to require recognizing this hypocrisy that often exists, and this is obviously not just a characteristic of Latin America. I must confess that I'm a little bit skeptical that states are kind of willing to, that they have this level of ambition, but rather than being stuck in my cynicism, I decided to think about, well, what kind of arrangements would be possible to push through, to improve environmental democratic conditions in the region. I think ultimately the democratic impact of this agreement will depend on whether it facilitates learning about the experiences over the past 20 years. Because even though this agreement is new, most of the content isn't new. Most states have had some kind of experience with access rights, participation, etc. for a couple of decades, and there's been many limitations and problems with those. And I think one of the strengths of this new agreement is that it may give an opportunity, a forum, a space to expose those problems and to kind of force states to be accountable or to justify their decisions in light of those existing experiences. So rather than think about Escazú only as an agreement on access rights, I'm suggesting we think about it as a democratization project. A democratization project that, like all democratization projects, is looking to strengthen democratic principles and values like participation, representation, accountability, and participation, progressively over time. Democracy is not something that we have or don't have, but rather something that we can, look to continue to build by strengthening those principles. Now, firstly, so I'm proposing we think of it as a democratization project with these 4 elements: inclusive multilateral cooperation, access rights, protection of earth defenders or environmental defenders, and accountability, which I'll highlight as a really particular crucial point for achieving the rest of the democratic ambition. Firstly, a few words on the negotiation process. The negotiations were really innovative in their transparency and in their inclusion of civil society. Often we see in multilateralism that civil society has a kind of cosmetic or tokenistic involvement. This wasn't the case in these negotiations. Civil society played a really fundamental role in the content and also kind of pushing the process forward. But they were able to propose, they were able to propose articles. They were able to comment on the text being negotiated, and they were really quite effective. One of the reasons that they were so effective is that almost all of the civil society representatives belonged to a single transnational network. It's a Washington-based network, the Access Rights Initiative, which is hosted by the World Resources Institute. I certainly don't intend to kind of criticize this network at all. They're individuals who are really committed to this project of access rights. But in the interest of thinking about democratization, I think it's important to recognize that there was, dominance has a negative connotation, but they were, the coordinating civil society, more than coordinating, they were kind of representing civil society in the process. So formally, the negotiations were open to anybody from civil society who wanted to participate, but in practice, participation was very limited in terms of numbers and diversity. Some of the interviews that I did, people were recognized this. One participant recognized that it was quite elitist because almost all civil society representatives or participants were white, and almost all of them were lawyers. And we know when we think about people affected by environmental problems in Latin America, they're mostly not white and they're mostly not lawyers. So I think that's something to recognize and try to draw lessons from. Participation was partly limited because the negotiations had such a low profile. Most people had absolutely no idea that they were going on. One of the representatives who didn't belong, one of the only representatives who didn't belong to that network, he'd been studying access rights for many years. He'd been involved in the Aarhus Convention, and he didn't participate until halfway through because he didn't know the negotiations were going on. So if we think about someone with that level of kind of knowledge, that didn't, technical knowledge, didn't know the negotiations were going on, then it does kind of reveal how kind of the low profile of these negotiations. Some people commented that it was hard to get people interested in the topic. That people are more interested in substantive issues or substantive rights, preventing climate change or saving the birds or protecting biodiversity, but they see procedural issues as more technical and kind of less exciting. I'm a little bit doubtful about that argument. I think there's more that needs to be unpacked. Once the negotiations were framed in a way that resonated with people's experience, a few more people became involved. Indigenous people, for example, weren't involved for most of the negotiations until there was this proposal to include an article on protecting earth defenders. This kind of resonated with their own experience and concerns, and they started to become a little bit more engaged in the process. So I think one lesson to be taken from this is that, ongoing participation is that participation isn't always spontaneous, and that it really needs the framing needs to connect with people's own experiences of democracy and their own concerns. Now, I'm not going to, I'm just going to mention kind of one of these. These are the 3 access rights. I'm just going to say a few words to draw. My intention is kind of to say that there are lessons to be learned from, the past couple of decades of experience with each of these access rights. And if the agreement is going to have an impact, then we really need to, it needs to kind of be able to draw out these lessons and to try to correct for them in the future. So for now, I'm just going to say a few words on the access right of participation in environmental matters. So the agreement obligates states to provide participation mechanisms, but it doesn't precisely define what constitutes a legitimate participation mechanism. So states have quite a lot of kind of control over how they define kind of the kind of participatory mechanisms that they want to provide. I don't think this is a problem. I think the lack of a definition is probably good, because if they had defined legitimate mechanisms, they probably would have been very weak. That tends to be the norm in negotiations. When they define things, that it tends to have a very low bar. So the fact that there isn't a kind of specific definition, I think, is useful, because it allows continual debate over what kind of participatory mechanisms are democratically favourable, and it allows citizens to continue to demand different mechanisms than those that exist. So participation mechanisms in Latin America have been really common in the past 20 years. All sorts of actors, from multilateral development banks, the World Bank, transnational corporations, civil society, indigenous communities, all of these actors have shown interest in participatory mechanisms. But all of those actors have different expectations about what is the purpose of participation and what is the objective or the expected outcome of those mechanisms. So elite actors, multilateral development banks, corporations, tend to assume that participatory mechanisms are useful for creating a stable investment environment, to resolve tension and make it stable to continue with the investment. Grassroots actors tend to be divided between those who see participation as a way of gaining more financial benefit from a proposed project, and those who see participatory mechanisms as a way of having control over the decision to proceed or not. So there are some people that, when they're invited to participate, have the expectation that they're going to be allowed to say no. Research by Marcela Torres Wong, who's done some research, really interesting research in Bolivia, Peru, and Mexico, she's shown that whenever a consultation is held, the project is always adopted. So that is, if communities participate in a participatory mechanism, that can be a good strategy for extracting more kind of financial benefit, but it's not a good strategy for, prohibiting extractivism on their territory, for example. Projects are always approved. So the main weakness here is that there is the participatory mechanisms in Latin America don't provide the opportunity to question the development models being promoted. These mechanisms take place in a context of what an Argentine sociologist, Maristela Svampa, calls the commodity consensus, kind of playing on the words of the Washington Consensus. The commodity consensus reflects this shared belief that the only way for Latin American countries to progress is to supply the global north with primary resources necessary to meet their consumer demands. And the result is concentrated agricultural production, extraction, and export of natural resources. Sometimes communities have found that the best way to influence, to have an impact on an investment project, is by refusing to participate, or actively disengaged from those invited spaces, and to create their own participatory spaces. So to give an example, a couple of examples of this, in Argentina, for example, in 2002, in the city of Escazú, a United States mining corporation arrived to propose a gold and silver mine. And they allowed these kind of participatory mechanisms, consultations. The citizens quickly realized that the official participatory mechanism didn't provide any opportunity for sharing their own visions or sharing their own values. It only provided the opportunity to comment on the technical details, the technical viability of the project. And so many of them boycotted. They boycotted the official consultations, there were protests, and they demanded their own public referendum, which was refused. At first, the authorities refused. The authorities saying, no, this project is we're debating this project through this mechanism. But protests became so kind of diverse and so widespread that they agreed to hold a referendum, a non-binding referendum. 80% of the population rejected the mine, and the authorities agreed with the corporation to cancel the project. So by refusing to engage, they were able to have a greater impact. Another example from Peru that Fabiana Lee describes is how a community refused to enter a public hearing in which they were given the opportunity to comment on a 600-page environmental impact assessment. They realized that there was really no opportunity for that process to take into account their values and visions. They didn't have their own capacity to comment on the technical details of a 600-page document, so they disengaged and refused to participate. I think, if we think about access rights, we think, well, that's a failure of access rights. That's a failure of democracy. People aren't participating. I would argue instead that voicing opposition in this way can have a really powerful impact on democracy, and we should understand it as an alternative form of participation rather than non-participation. I think visibly refusing to participate in a mechanism that is seen as illegitimate can have the effect of representing alternative perspectives and kind of making visible those problems rather than kind of hiding them. So I think in terms of implementing the Escazú Agreement, there should be attention to when people are not participating, when people are refusing to engage. This third element of the protection of earth defenders. The Escazú Agreement sets a precedent in international environmental law by recognizing the concept of vulnerability and the vulnerability of what they call human rights defenders in environmental matters, and the role that they play in sustainable development. So parties are required to guarantee the safety of earth defenders and protect and promote all of their human rights. Now, from a human rights perspective, this is really, this is absolutely important, this agreement, this article, Article 9, because as Caspar said at the beginning, more earth defenders are killed in Latin America than any other region. The vast majority are indigenous people. Indigenous people are overly represented and disproportionately killed. So I think there's a lot more that could be said about the human rights perspective, but I want to stress that the democratization impact of this agreement as well. Earth defenders are precisely those people who are articulating and representing perspectives that tend to be marginalized in debates about sustainability and in those kind of participatory mechanisms that are available. These are people who put their lives in danger with these campaigns to halt extractivist projects, and these are the kind of the campaigns that if we're willing to look and see, that really expose the violent and unsustainable characteristic of much of the commodity consensus and existing political and economic institutions. And I think this agreement might help us to see these campaigns a little bit more, to give them more exposure. So one of the innovations of the agreement that one of the things that is being organized is this annual forum on human rights defenders in environmental matters in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I think this was the first one was held last year, and I think this could be a forum that is completely unprecedented in the region. It's a way to bring, so last year state representatives and civil society representatives listened to testimonies of indigenous people and non-indigenous people who are defending the environment. And this was, the first opportunity that most of them would have had to be, to listen to those testimonies. I think it's really important to recognize one of the factors that is going to make it hard to comply with this, with these obligations, and that's this trend towards the criminalization of activism, the criminalization of contestation, the criminalization of resistance. This is something that, alarmingly we're seeing in other parts of the world as well, in the United States and the UK, where activists are being framed as criminals or as terrorists when they're not actually engaging in violent action. But this is certainly this is a very familiar problem in Latin America, where earth defenders are often classified as criminals or terrorists, as a threat to stability and security. And in this way, you can legitimize kind of their continued repression. On the basis of existing experience, I think we should anticipate that some states will try to kind of evade the obligations of Article 9 by framing activists as criminals or terrorists, and therefore, not eligible for these kind of protections. But, as criminalization continues to go on, I think this annual forum will be useful for highlighting ongoing experiences of criminalization. Finally, and I'll end here so we can open up for discussion, the accountability mechanism. This is still being designed. This was kind of left, it wasn't the details weren't negotiated before the agreement was adopted. This is being designed now. Almost all multilateral institutions have non-punitive compliance mechanisms, and this is the case with Escazú. Sometimes this is seen as a weakness if a compliance mechanism cannot punish or sanction a state who doesn't comply. Sometimes it's seen as quite weak. I don't think that is necessarily the case. In any case, there was never any question that the Escazú compliance mechanism would be cooperative, looking to kind of encourage compliance rather than punish non-compliance. And I think this could be useful in the case of Escazú, because the accountability mechanism could increase scrutiny of what states are doing, which is completely unprecedented, having a mechanism to scrutinize how states are behaving in terms of access rights, and to expose these kind of problems that we've seen over the past 2 decades with experiences with access rights. So ideally, this kind of mechanism would allow what James Mansbridge in particular calls narrative accountability and deliberative accountability. So narrative accountability is when an authority, a decision maker, addresses an audience and explains what they've done. They give an account of what they've done. Deliberative accountability is more of a two-way conversation between an authority, a decision maker, and affected people to ask questions. Both can ask questions, both can give explanations and justifications, and it's more of a communicative way to kind of try to build an understanding about how things are being done, and how mutually justifying their perspectives. So I think this kind of mechanism to scrutinize and justify how things are being done could be useful to kind of bring to the fore that question of hypocrisy that I mentioned at the beginning, this kind of mismatch or incoherence between what is being said or the rules that are written and then what is actually done. And I think it would be naive to assume that would resolve all of the problems with the environmental rights in Latin America. But I think in non-ideal terms, that kind of mechanism really could help to strengthen democratic conditions in Latin America. So I'll finish there and open up for discussion.
Thank you very much, Haley, for this wonderful, insightful exposition on the agreement. I don't know in which order you would like. Maybe Benedicta, you could start with your comment. I know that you have been doing research on fairly similar issues and also commented on the Escazú Agreement yourself.
First of all, thanks a lot for a very insightful talk, and not the least for raising the issue here in Norway. I don't think there wasn't that many people in Latin America that knew about the Escazú Agreement. In Norway, I think we're close to zero, and I really think Latin America deserves some attention and some praise for major efforts to negotiate this, and in many ways it's among the most advanced multilateral agreements on the environment that I think has quite a bit of potential. I've discussed it in the context of this idea of the emergence of a green state that also rests on some strong multilateral rules and on civil society. And so the Escazú process is kind of, in that sense, a really interesting experiment for those of us that wishes that something like that could emerge in different parts of the world. And so, but I think that you have highlighted, and what has become evident is that the Escazú Agreement has occurred in a process that with a lot of really concerning changes in the surroundings. So I just wanted to highlight some of those, and then go into a few a few points based on what you were talking. And I think that lots of different happening changes in Latin America, of course, as elsewhere. One major change over the last 10 years, but that has accelerated the last couple of years, and as we speak, is the rise of China as a major economic actor. And you mentioned that the extracting resources in Latin America is about exporting to the global north. That's not true anymore for South America. Their main trading partner, and that's basically only natural resources, that's China. China takes 40% of Chile's exports, for example, which is mostly copper. And what has happened the last couple of years is that China has become a major investor, the major investor. Latin America is the only region in the world where Chinese investments are growing, and there are in many sectors, but natural resources is still the most important. And most recently, new investment in lithium in Bolivia, and there's lithium investments in Argentina, it's elsewhere. And that, I think, is something that is changing some of the premises of the Escazú Agreement, because you mentioned that the World Bank, all of these investors, they have a long experience, they have met resistance, and they have developed participatory mechanisms. Now, these are not perfect, far from it, but they've been in place. The Chinese completely ignore civil society. There is a few changes. There is signs that they are learning. They have also met resistance in different communities, but there is no experience in actually taking the relationship to the community seriously. I discussed this with a Chinese colleague, and who has researched Chinese investments in Africa a lot, and he said, "Oh, you know, we Chinese, we are a paternalistic society. We don't talk to the kids. We talk to those that pay for the candy." That was his, and that is still some. So that's one part of this change. The other kind of concerning tendency is democratic backsliding that you see, sort of increasing the emergence of a kind of authoritarian populism in many countries, to the left, to the right, and that has a lot of things in common. The kind of TikTokization of politics, many tricks in their playbooks that are common, and that they pay absolutely no attention to environmental issues. The last in the long series is El Salvador, where I've done a lot of work. They're now talking about opening for mining in this tiny little country with extremely scarce water resources and very vulnerable nature. They managed to put in place, or civil society and many others, a mining ban a few years ago. Now, in this context of the new environmental populism, or new populism, that's open for question again. So that's the second part. And then there is a third one, and that is a transformation of organized crime. And I think that is really important to keep in mind when we're talking about these issues, because you mentioned that Latin America is the region in the world where most environmental defenders are killed, and that is true. And a lot of those situations where that happens, they are characterized by a mix of legal extractive projects, but also a lot of illegal projects, lack of state presence in the where those things are happening. And the transformation is a multi-dimensional one. One positive sign is this quite steep reduction of murder rate, overall murder rates in the region. And we're not used to talk about that because we think of this as kind of the murder region of the world, and that's true, but you've seen a steady decline over the last years.
Mostly El Salvador that's driving those statistics, or?
No, actually not. I mean, that's driving a lot, but in most countries, even Venezuela, it's still on top, but it's like half of what it was some years ago. Mexico is driving it in a different direction, but if you look at the overall trend, it's downwards. And that is probably has to do with the kind of organized crime. And one of the crime categories that's increasing is precisely those that are related to the environment. So you see more environmental defenders killed, but that doesn't really show up in the statistics because there we're talking about thousands. And in terms of environmental defenders, they're extremely tragic and terrible for the struggle, but they don't make a big change to the statistics. So in that context is where the Escazú Agreement finally gets agreed upon, and they start and enter into effect. That happened in 2021. And that is a context where I think they've got a lot of headwinds, I think, and there is some risks with it in that context. And I think that the process around the Escazú Agreement, that raises the issue of how can increased rights actually change the societal debate about things, because there is a tendency for there's no lack of laws and no lack of lawyers in Latin America. I think Colombia, I don't know if that's a myth that Colombia is the country with the highest number of lawyers per capita in the world, but it wouldn't surprise me if it were true. And at the same time, it's one of the countries with the highest numbers of murders of environmental activists. But I think there is a complete lack of social dialogue about how to integrate developmental and environmental concerns, and that is really unfortunate, because then you end up with some kind of some legal rights of environmental defenders and other laws, but that ends up in a very polarized debate. And you saw that in many countries, that the debate was very polarized between also some people come with the Escazú Agreement, but they are against development. If we are going to develop this country, we need renewable energy. That will also take land and end up in. It's not just extractive projects. It's also wind farms. It's solar plants. It's lithium, of course. That's very much needed for the green transformation, for batteries to electric cars, etc. The copper is needed for the green transformation, but there is no real debate about how can we integrate some idea of development into a green transformation, and the other way around, green issues into a thought of development. So development has become kind of likened to imperialism and extractivism. And I think that is really unfortunate, and that is something that I think needs to be discussed further, the trade-offs. I work in a center that was established precisely to discuss those trade-offs like 30 years ago, and I don't think we've managed. I think we've ended up in a very polarized situation. And then a related point is that you mentioned that laws are completely inadequate. That is one point I disagree with. I think there is a lot of really good laws in Latin America. The problem is that they're not enforced, and that the institutions are not strengthened. Latin America, almost all the Latin American countries have ratified already many years ago the ILO Convention 162 that protects indigenous rights. And that has raised a debate. It's given them some legal tools, but it hasn't really protected a lot of indigenous communities. And there was even an interesting argument in the literature about the processes of democratization in Latin America, where they went fastest and where they met resistance. And one argument is that where the states were weak, the democratization was more accepted by the elites, precisely because they knew it wouldn't have much effect. So you have a country like Colombia, where you have a very advanced democracy and incredibly solid central institutions. The problem is that the way that the country is governed in the different regions is something completely different. And so I think, and that is, of course, you can't build states through an international agreement. I think one would want that. You can contribute to the acceptance and of certain rights, but the other side of the coin, which is to actually have solid institutions that are present across the country, is very difficult to do through that kind of institutions. And there could even be an argument that if you don't develop some kind of economic activities in some of those areas where there is often a lot of resistance, there is also very little possibility that you will have any kind of state presence. And that could, in turn, worsen the environmental situation, because there will be illegal activities. There is a number of other activities going on there. So I would just raise those concerns. But I think in spite, and just to add to that, there is a little bit of a tendency, and you mentioned it yourself, that these kind of agreements end up being pushed by a relatively small liberal elite. And unfortunately, that liberal elite is kind of, it doesn't have its best moments in Latin America. It is facing a lot of headwinds. But anyways, thanks a lot for raising it. I think the more it's talked about, the more it gets known in the world, the stronger it might also be in Latin America.
Thank you very much for this. Lucas, what is your take on?
So let me start also by echoing Benedict in saying that, what a privilege it is to be discussing Latin America here. So thank you, Casper, for organizing, and thank you, Haley, for for bringing this topic, and Benedict as well for the excellent comments. I should also say that I don't have a research specifically on the Escazú myself, nor do I research environmental democracy per se. So what I would do here is just propose 3 broad questions, right, and bring a few related comments. Some of which echo some of the points that Benedict has raised that relate to it that cross-cut with some of the dynamics that I identify in my research about Latin American regionalism in general and regional environmental governance of the Amazon, which is what I research. So I think one common denominator we find in Latin American regionalism is, and not less so, or perhaps even more so in environmental topics, is the general concern of Latin American publics and elite with sovereignty, right? something that appears in Benedict's research as well. So I think that this concern, we can think of that as threefold. So first, we have a concern with international obligations, right, that restrain the legislative and regulatory capacity of states, right, the most standard, typical sovereign concern, which is like the typical one that we have that has hindered economic integration in the region, so on and so forth. And of course, we should expect this to be very much a concern in a legally binding instrument, as you mentioned. And from what I see and hearing from you, this seems to be very much a concern around the ratification process now, the ratification process in several countries now. So my first question, which is tied to that, is a bit optimistic actually. Is what can we learn from the Escazú negotiation process? You hinted a bit on the application, but on the presentation, but I want to prompt you to perhaps to discuss more with us. What we can learn that in terms of how states can mitigate that concern about sovereignty, and how those lessons can help us to think about ways of mitigating those concerns also in the ratification process going ahead, right? So I mentioned threefold, that I think of a threefold concern with sovereignty. A second one, which I think is very much present in the Amazon case, for instance, is a concern with extra-regional influence, right? So some have pointed out in Latin American in the literature about Latin American regionalism in general, that that cooperation in the region often takes a defensive form, right? So it's thought of as a way for states to build in regional institutions to control their linkage with global regimes, basically, right? So my impression is that what we have going on here in the Escazú process has some of that in terms of like normative localization. They could have joined the Aarhus Convention. They decided to build their own instruments, and they do that by substantially separating themselves from the Aarhus Conventions and in a way that brings specific challenges of the region, right? And solutions for those challenges as well. But within my limited knowledge about the Escazú Agreement and negotiation process, as well as from your presentation, it does not seem to be the case that this was a predominant feature driving the process in a way, right? You mentioned that in terms of like actually the first trigger being Chile being prompted by in the process of the OECD ascension to discuss that, and that kind of like steering then later steering the negotiation process. But it seems that the process was a great deal driven by local normative entrepreneurs, local civil society, and ECLAC-CEPAL. So my second question would be, how did you see this constellation of domestic and transnational civil society actors interacting, other extra-regional organizations, states, and global governance organizations, and interacting with the negotiating parties, right? Which actors do you see as driving most of the process, pushing ambition, and which ones do you see as offering resistance? So a third way to complete the in which sovereignty becomes salient, which I think is perhaps the most relevant here and resonates with what has been said by both Benedict and Haley and you, and in terms of like sovereignty as kind of like in terms of retaining the sovereignty barrier, right? Retaining sovereignty as a way of retaining domestic discretion over of mechanisms of participation, of deliberation, of producing policy. As has been mentioned, Latin America has been experimenting with participation, has some of the most like been at some point in the forefront of experiment with participation. Like my hometown is an icon of that, with a particular budget in Porto Alegre. So it's not to say that Latin America is necessarily afraid of the participation, but kind of like we see this concern with kind of controlling these channels and mostly controlling how these channels can influence or bind policymaking, right? And retaining that at domestic level, avoiding that you can have extra supranationally imposed restrictions on this control. So that's something we see in the ACTO, right? Where we have channels of engagements pretty much defined by the state and restricted by state mediation at the project level mostly. Yet I found interesting that while the Escazú retains, as you said, a lot of discretion for the states to define that mediation, which I found interesting to mention that it's a positive thing that kind of like can allows for greater ambition at the domestic level. It does have some very clear provisions that can help set common standards around transparency, participation, and justice. And implementing them, I would assume, can have substantial advancement in environmental democracy in the region. So, like, just to some examples that strike me from your thought and from taking a closer look at the agreement, kind of like the creation of like the provision that mandates the creation of some channels of participation. That can be improvement in several countries that don't have that, while some others have. And the same, like the provision on active removal of barriers to participation in terms of language and geography, and guaranteeing the adaptation of channels of participation to the language and characteristics of the public. That's something that kind of like can have enormous impacts for the access of indigenous groups, for instance. And also, when talking about of justice more directly, again, the removal of linguistic barriers to access to justice, the reversal of the burden of proof, and the what we all discussed now, and thinks for one of the most salient aspects of it, which is the protection of defenders, all could have mean kind of like important progress if implemented by the states. So I think that kind of like on face value, from my impression is that kind of like the agreement seems to be kind of like and something that you both mentioned. It puts kind of like it signals towards a normative consensus that can reverse some of those trends for instance, of exclusion of indigenous groups or threat to environmental defenders that is still in the region. But of course, the main challenge is, I guess, the ways in which states are going to implement that agreement, and whether that might entail losing some control in terms of participation and of accountability. So my final question is it's about implementation, right? We have Latin America is a very heterogeneous region where you have like some more consolidated democracies, some regions that are kind of like have many different types of many varieties of democracy in Latin America, and even authoritarian regimes. Some of which, as Benedict mentioned, have already a quite established legal framework that resonates with what has been provided in the agreement already. But several of them face difficulty of enforcing those provisions. I think like Bolsonaro has ignored many international obligations, but it has also ignored several provisions of the Constitution, right? In terms of, for instance, protection of indigenous rights, right? And the consequence of that within the domestic regimes are pretty much unclear still, right? So my final question would be for you, kind of, how do you see this heterogeneity of regimes and of the region itself providing different types of challenges for the implementation of the regime in different countries, right? Do you see kind of specific challenges of implementation coming up in different states? And also relatedly, I think this heterogeneity we also find in the Aarhus Convention, right? So do you think there is any lessons learned that Latin America can take from that could help think both through the ratification process, but mainly through the implementation process?
Thank you very much for this, Lucas. I also have a very short question. Since the agreement is, as Benedict pointed out, more of a novelty for the Norwegian audience, could you also just briefly explain the status right now? Because I know that 14 countries have ratified it, and you said it's legally binding. Does it mean that it's already in force?
It's in force, yep.
And then it's also binding on those countries that have not yet ratified it?
It's only legally binding on those countries that have ratified it.
Okay.
Yep. So it came into force in 2021 on Earth Day. Argentina and Mexico coordinated their ratification so that it would come into effect symbolically on that day. Yeah. Wow, absolutely wonderful insights. Really, really do appreciate. I've been taking notes, as you know. I haven't felt like this since I was a student in a lecture, so it's wonderful to have so many wonderful comments. I'll just make a couple of brief comments, and then so that we can hear from the audience as well. So just to pick out one point that Benedict made. That democratization is faster in countries with weak institutions because elites don't resist if they know that it won't be so consequential. And that's one thing that we've seen with the Escazú Agreement, that one of the first countries to ratify was Nicaragua. And I think that's really unhelpful for the rest of the region, because it does give the impression, well, this is just a useless agreement. If Nicaragua can ratify, obviously they're not going to implement it. So there is, I think that it was kind of ratified quite quickly in countries with weak institutions, knowing that it would be inconsequential. I think you're absolutely right that it's not a case of a lack of laws or inadequate laws. There are very good laws that are not implemented. And I think partly that might explain some of the lack of interest of many actors during there was a low profile of the negotiations, and the private sector was invited to participate, and they mostly didn't. I think mostly because they're used to these laws have been in place in many countries for a long time, and they're not implemented. And so the private sector, I think in many countries, didn't feel particularly threatened by this by this agreement. So weak institutions is going to be a massive challenge for the implementation. So just to pick up a couple of things that Lucas said, on one of the things on the extraterritoriality, where the Aarhus Convention allows somebody to make a claim against an actor in another country. So somebody in Poland can make a claim against a German-based actor. That was never, I think that was probably one of the main factors that scared off Latin American countries, because of, exactly as Lucas says, that main concern about sovereignty. And I interviewed about 22 of the negotiators, state and non-state representatives, and I asked them about this question of extraterritoriality, and it was just like a non-issue. It was, well, of course that was never going to be, because of sovereignty, that was never on the agenda. People can only have a right within their own country and can't make a claim against another country. I think, about the extra-regional interference, that there is kind of this resistance to interference from other countries. There was this kind of desire to create a Latin American agreement by and for Latin Americans, but it wasn't really a state-driven process. It wasn't a state-driven process at all. It was really a very small number of individuals who really drove the negotiations. The main person in Chile, she'd written her master's thesis on the topic, and she was just personally really committed to it. And she was the person mandated with the OECD discussions, and so it was really this kind of personal project, and she kind of found individuals in other countries who were equally kind of interested, and they really drove it. And I think that's partly why the state kind of weren't really involved so much, even though the foreign ministries were involved in the negotiations. It didn't really attract the interest of state institutions. And that was why, in some countries, once it became open for ratification, it became politicized, because suddenly they became aware of this. So in Costa Rica, it almost, it passed unanimously in the first debate in the legislation, and it went to the second stage of for signing, and the second kind of, sorry, I can't remember the terms that they use, but the kind of the second stage of legislation, and then it ran into problems. And then it started people starting to ask questions, well, what is this agreement about? Initially, they just voted unanimously to approve it because they hadn't read it, and they just kind of assumed it was okay. And then it became politicized. So I think in some countries, the low profile helped because they just ratified it thinking, well, this is fine. And in other countries, it became politicized once people became kind of aware of the contents. In Costa Rica, in the lead up to elections, it became vulnerable to politicization, etc. But it was very much an individual people-driven, network-driven negotiation process, and not kind of a state regional building, region building process. So I think, yeah, we can open up to Casper. We can open up to other comments and questions.
Do we have any questions? Yes? There's a microphone there. So.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm Arthur, working for the Belgian embassy, but I'm following this lecture for my own particular interest because I have a strong connection with Nicaragua. And my question is there a possibility that the treaty can deal with the lack of interest of some governments in environmental issues? Yeah, and the economic aspect at the other side, the rise of mining, for example, in the region and everything. Can they combine it? Is there a possibility to deal with this for these governments in Latin America? Thank you.
I would say yes for a couple of reasons. So there is still, so far, there is still kind of a welcoming of civil society within the multilateral space. So now that it's come into effect, there is the annual conference of the parties, which we're holding the second one in Buenos Aires this year. Civil society from countries that aren't parties to the treaty can participate, and so they'll be able to be involved, and they can, potentially kind of draw attention to problems within their own countries. I lost my train of thought. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you just repeat the last point of your question? Because I had something to say and I just forgot. I'm sorry.
If they can deal with the economic interests and
yes. Sorry, I remembered. I found my train of thought. Thank you. So one thing that Benedict a point that she made was that there is a real lack of social dialogue on these questions. Maybe it's a bit stronger in other countries. I know in Argentina it's just completely absent. Just the act of recycling is considered radical. Right? This is the level of environmental kind of awareness, and so I think the fact that there's a real lack of social dialogue, the treaty could help address that. We know that when there is a conference of the parties, when there is a kind of an international meeting, that attracts attention, attracts media attention. Countries like to be the host because they attract media attention. And so just the mere fact that there will be a conference of the parties each year and that will be in a different city, then that kind of will help to bring kind of greater social visibility to these questions that are mostly not talked about. Many countries are very urbanized and a long way. I think I'm obviously most familiar with the Argentine case. It's a very urbanized country. Most people have absolutely no idea of the social and environmental consequences of extractivism or opposition to that, or the implications for human rights. And so one possible kind of side effect of this treaty will be to stimulate some more attention to these issues. Yeah, beyond just climate change. I mean, I know when I moved to Argentina in 2017 to start a new job, they asked me to design a course on climate change, which I did. I just published my own book, Global Environmental Politics, which had climate change as one chapter among another, a whole host of environmental issues. I thought, well, ideally I would teach with this book, but or change it to Spanish and teach that book. But they wanted climate change, and so I designed a course on climate change. And then only a couple of years later, it occurred to me that actually the person who asked me to design that course just thinks that environment is climate change, and that there's no more to it. And so by asking me to teach about climate change, I could have developed, a course on all environmental issues, because they really had no idea. They think climate change is environment is climate change. So there's no real sense that there are these other these issues that aren't directly related to climate change. It's a kind of a lack of understanding.
I think the impact now will depend a lot on whether they're able to latch onto what is a fragile but still existing drive towards more regional cooperation in general, which has two principal reasons that happens now. It is that there's more governments that are ideologically kind of more related, center-leftish governments, and the other is more specifically Lula, and that regional cooperation in Latin America needs a leader. It hasn't had one for the last, don't remember when Lula ended his office, it was 2010. Now they do. Now, Lula has a lot on his plates, and so regional cooperation will not necessarily be really on top of the agenda, but there is some tendency towards more regional cooperation. And if you could consider the Escazú Agreement in that context and make that kind of a part of this new drive towards more regional cooperation, I think that then it could also have more of a leverage. There's actually, it was just a few days ago, the last country signed on, Belize.
Oh,
Right.
I missed that. No,
Yeah.
it's traveling. All right.
The Belize has agreed. It doesn't really matter in the big scheme of things, but it's another
It's one
country.
more, yeah.
So there is something happening, and I think that there is some positive signs. I also think it is a big challenge for Europeans and other external actors to be supportive without pushing too much, because then it will be considered international interference. And the argument that you hear in country after country, this is pushed by the NGO, the facade NGOs. So they're just facades of external interference. It's not things that you only hear in Latin America, but I think I hear that repeated more and more often, and that is a risk. So I think that it's a challenge for Norway and for other European countries to support in a good way without being seen as interfering.
Yeah, I think just to add briefly a comment, I think that's really important because it has become so ideological, where there is a danger that, once Chilean government changed and they ratified, and then Argentine, so the left-leaning governments ratified, and it now is associated as this left project. But on the other hand, the World Bank, international institutions, financial institutions, the Inter-American Development Bank, they are getting behind it, and they're kind of showing their support. So that kind of gives a bit of a balance to this tendency to now associate it as a left-wing project, which I don't think is very helpful in a government that is kind of constantly oscillating between the left and the right. Mm.
And we've seen many regional projects go that way when due to those ebbs and flows. Just to second what Benedict said before about kind of like the regional integration resurgence in a way. I think one interesting thing that could also help to make it go beyond ideological lines is that kind of big component of Lula's regional project now is around environmental cooperation, right? Is around kind of like specifically about kind of like the Amazon. And part of that is creating ways of attracting international cooperation that can help fund the protection of the Amazon, and that can I think can spill over to several other relevant issues, right? And that can help create domestic interests in stewardship, right? And can help them to find kind of like some to embed those interests in a way, to taking an optimistic look, let's say. So I think that's going to be.
Yeah. Hello. My name is Torbjørn Holt. I'm a pensioner, and I'm here on pure private interest. It's a very interesting subject. I think it was Benedict who mentioned that China have 40% of the control of the raw materials in Latin America or something like that. So, yeah.
About Chile, but they're the main trading partner for all of South America, and they're mainly buying raw materials. Yeah.
And we know that, as you also said, that China, they're pretty smart. They don't go to war, but they go to poor countries and make deals to exploit their raw materials, or in Africa and Latin America, etc. And they have not on human rights on their agenda at all. So my question is really, how can this be limited? Do you want to stop it, or is it a way to? It doesn't matter only for China. I think it's American companies also do the same things, and can that be limited? And so the countries take care of their own production in Latin America.
It's a really important point that Benedict raised and that you've now repeated, and it does really change the dynamics of how to drive sustainability initiatives. If we think back over the past couple of decades, where some of the major initiatives like the soy moratorium, which put a ban on producing soy in native forested areas in the Amazon, that was largely driven by. It was driven by and helped by consumer demand in Europe, with these campaigns in McDonald's that were showing kind of the link between purchasing a burger in McDonald's and the deforestation. People could start to see the link, and that really, Greenpeace with these campaigns really had a strong impact. We know the soy moratorium is not perfect because it did reduce deforestation in the Amazon, but then it did lead to kind of a displacement of the problem to other parts of forest which weren't protected. This Cerrado forest, which wasn't included in the moratorium, had an increase in deforestation. But apart from the fact that it wasn't perfect, that kind of consumer-driven demand from Europe helped to protect some of the Amazon forest. And we're not going to see that same consumer interest in China. There is where environmental concerns, my understanding, I'm not a China expert, but my understanding is that where there are environmental concerns in China, it tends to be much more domestic and localized rather than a concern for transnational kind of global environmental problems. So that really does change the dynamics.
Yeah, we're actually having a research project on the role of China in environmental governance, among other things, in Latin America and Africa. And I think there's some trends that there's one little positive trend, and then there's something that's really concerning, especially related to this. And the positive thing is that there's this launch of Xi Jinping's ecological civilization as this major new concept coming out of China, and there is some intent to implement that also in projects that they're investing in and in their international relations. It's very imperfect, but there is some debate about it, at least, of how to implement their idea of ecological civilization that can be somehow similar to sustainable development, with some differences also in other parts of the world. So that was the optimistic thing. The really troublesome issue with the Chinese investments is the lack of transparency. And that goes completely contrary to the Escazú Agreement, which is about access to information, that all their contracts with the counterparts, everything is secret. And that is part of their policy. And it's incredibly difficult for us as researchers to get access to really understand based on what premises. And in that sense, they maintain their right to keep things secret. And that is, it couldn't be more contrary to the spirit of the Escazú Agreement, which is exactly about disclosure of information and the right to access information. There's a lot of research going on in different local areas about Chinese projects, and there is some tendency towards that they also have learned. They've been in many places for a longer time. They've learned also to communicate with communities, but I think the issue of transparency is so problematic. And the other issue is just the increased tension that Latin America is very vulnerable also to the tension between the US and China, and that there is a need to cooperate with China on many issues, fisheries, Chinese fishing in Latin American waters is a major issue, also a lot of illegal fishing. In order to stop that, you very much need cooperation, and you need a platform for dialogue. And in the climate that's increasingly evolving in the whole world, but also very much in Latin America, that dialogue is very difficult.
Tatjana Stankovic, I'm a researcher here at NUPI. So I was wondering whether this agreement that we discussed, Escazú Agreement, Escazú Agreement, is that like a novelty? Are there like similar agreements in other parts of the world or in other issue areas? How novel the institutional design is, if there are like a similar agreements? Yeah.
A lot of it was cut and paste from the Aarhus Convention. Really, it was kind of a cut and paste and editing. For a lot of it is that way. It's innovative and in the recognition of human rights defenders in environmental matters. And it was after the treaty was adopted that the United Nations General Assembly then adopted a declaration that also recognized human rights defenders. So it's been unprecedented in that what's Article 9 is the defenders of protecting defenders of they have this long convoluted term that they use, but the human rights defenders in environmental matters. So that's and recognizing the concept of vulnerability, vulnerable groups. That's really kind of unprecedented in international environmental law. But apart from that, it's mostly cut and paste from Aarhus, but taking out the option to make a demand on another country. Yeah.
Was legally binding?
Yes. Yeah.
It's a very simple question, sorry. Yeah, I'm Paola, I'm a researcher at the University of Oslo. I work on wind farms mostly, and I just wonder if, like, I'm seeing it from like the industry perspective, like if this is going to be something that they would need to consider, like for example, the Equator principles, like is that something, like what is the role that this new agreement will play in licensing processes for new projects?
Yeah, so the Equator principles are voluntary, and this will be obligatory. So, but it's obligatory in very broad sense, where the state has to require the private sector, the company who is proposing a project, to carry out some form of consultation. But the precise design of that will probably be will certainly be decided by elites, either by the company itself or the state, which provides certain options. But it will be, in theory, formally, it will be obligatory rather than voluntary. Yeah.
Thank you, very good presentation. My name is Odin. I'm a master's student at the University of Oslo. My question is regarding the rights of indigenous peoples, because you said there were a lot of killings of indigenous peoples, and how will this agreement affect their status in the societies, and like with projects like you just asked, and are there any options for sanctioning the parties within this agreement?
Yeah, there's absolutely no form of sanction proposed at all. It's designed as a cooperative mechanism. The compliance mechanism is designed to help countries to comply, recognizing that they won't be able. In many cases, they may not comply immediately, but it's designed to be progressively a progressive agreement in terms of progressively complying. So the effect on indigenous peoples, well, most of the countries, like Benedict said, have already signed the ILO agreement, which gives, the prior informed consent is required. Many states have signed that, well, they don't comply with it. In some cases, in Peru, for example, the state decides, well, who is an indigenous person? And so they deny that right to some people by saying, well, you're not really indigenous, even though there are people, the people who are in mining areas are often define themselves as indigenous. So it's a very, it's that kind of definition of who is indigenous and not will limit the impact of that ILO agreement. The Escazú Agreement doesn't have any of those kind of definitions, so it applies to everybody. So it's unprecedented in that way because the ILO Convention only applies to indigenous people. The Escazú Agreement doesn't require the consent of anybody except the state. So there will be people who want to have a binding participatory mechanism where they have the final say. I don't think we can anticipate that anywhere. It's really unlikely. That may be, and that's debatable whether democratically that's ideal or not. But certainly those expectations will need to be managed because we've seen that a participatory mechanism can be as simple as inviting people to a meeting like this, distributing a 600-page document, giving them the opportunity to comment, and okay, you've participated. That's often in practice what participation looks like. Yeah.
So just to provide a pinch of salt, perhaps, at the end. First of all, some countries are not. Some countries in the region are not signatories. So, like Venezuela has not even signed up for the agreement in the first place. Then there's countries that have not ratified it, like Brazil or Peru or
Costa Rica.
Costa Rica, surprisingly. I mean, Costa Rica has this reputation of being, of course, an environmental champion.
And they were one of Chile and Costa Rica led the entire process. And then Costa Rica refused to ratify.
Escazú is in Costa Rica, which is also, yeah, I mean,
exactly.
It's very funny to have an agreement with the name of your city and not signing up to it. And then, of course, there's the question of implementation and whether you actually translate it into law and start to demand that your domestic actors abide by this. And then we have the question of external actors like China, who don't necessarily have the corporate social responsibility we expect some businesses to have. So are you optimistic? I mean, given all those conditions for the future of sustainable and environmental democracy in Latin America?
Oh, that's a terrible question to finish on. I struggle with that in my teaching as well. I think, well, how can we end the course in a note that's not so pessimistic? But I'm honestly not optimistic. It's really hard to be optimistic in these contexts. I think it's better to think of, can things be a little bit better, and rather than being optimistic that things will be resolved, problems will be resolved. I think this impact can have a positive impact, that things can be a bit better than they are now.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being here. And yeah, a big hand for our speakers.
Thank you. Thank you very much.